She gave everything, her love, her wealth, her life, for her family. But when betrayal struck, her own son and daughter-in-law tried to take everything she had. Alone and devastated, she faces the ultimate decision: fight back or lose it all. Can a mother reclaim her legacy from the hands of those she trusted most? Will her strength be enough to survive their greed, or is it already too late? Margaret had spent her entire life giving, never once expecting anything in return. She had raised her children, Jack and Laura, with the love and care that only a mother could provide, working tirelessly to ensure they had everything they needed. She had been their rock, the one constant in a world that seemed to change every day. Every birthday, every holiday, every major life event. Margaret was there, ensuring the celebrations were grand, ensuring that her family knew they were loved. For years, Margaret had provided for her family, from funding Jack's wedding to paying for Laura's college education. Every gift, every sacrifice, was a testament to the depth of her love. But now, as she sat in her dimly lit living room, the weight of it all pressed down on her. She had given everything, every penny, every moment, and yet when she needed them most, they were nowhere to be found. Margaret had spent her youth caring for her family, but now in her twilight years she found herself alone. Her children, now grown, were too busy with their own lives to care for her in the way she had cared for them. They had taken everything she had to offer, and when she needed their help, they disappeared. It had started subtly. The phone calls that became less frequent, the visits that grew shorter, the promises that were never kept. But it wasn't until the day she was rushed to the hospital with a heart condition that the true nature of her situation became clear. It was her son Jack who had rushed to her side, but not for the reasons she had hoped. Margaret had expected her children to rally around her in her time of need, to care for her as she had cared for them. Instead, she was met with an uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by her son's terse words. "Mom, we need to talk about the house." Margaret's heart sank as she lay in the sterile hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, her body weak and vulnerable. She had always known that the day would come when she would need her family, but she had never imagined it would come to this. Jack, once her pride and joy, had become a man she hardly recognized. His face, once filled with warmth, was now hardened, distant. He seemed less concerned with her health and more preoccupied with her estate. "You're getting older, Mom. The house, the property, it's time to think about what happens next." His words were calm, calculated. It was as if the woman who had raised him was nothing more than a means to an end. Margaret tried to sit up, her hand clutching the hospital sheets, her breath shallow. "What do you mean, Jack? I've worked my whole life for this family. I'm not going anywhere just yet." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm not saying you are, Mom, but we need to start thinking about the future. I've got my own family now, my own responsibilities. The house is too much for you. It's time to sell it." Margaret's head spun. She had spent years building a life in that house, a house filled with memories of her late husband, Thomas. How could Jack, her own son, be so callous? The house was the last thing she had left of Thomas, the last thing that had tied her to her past. Yet here Jack was talking about selling it as if it were nothing more than a piece of property. "Jack, I don't want to sell the house," Margaret said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is my home. It's where I raised you. It's all I have left." Jack's gaze turned cold. "It's just a house, Mom. You need to be realistic. You can't keep living here alone." Margaret felt a sting of betrayal. She had given him everything, every chance, every resource, every ounce of love she had. And now, in her time of need, he was ready to take it all away. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She wasn't going to let Jack see her cry. She had spent her life shielding her children from pain, but now it was her turn to face the truth. She was alone, and the people she had loved the most had turned their backs on her. "Jack, please, don't do this," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. But Jack didn't respond. He simply stood up, adjusting his tie, his expression unreadable. "I'll be back tomorrow to talk more about it. You need to rest, Mom." And with that he left. The next few weeks were a blur. Margaret's health continued to deteriorate, and the visits from Jack became fewer and farther between. When he did show up, it was always with the same agenda: to talk about the house, about money, about the future. But never once did he ask how she was feeling or whether she needed anything. It was as if her well-being was secondary to his desires. Lily, Jack's wife, was no better. The woman who had once seemed so sweet and kind had turned into someone unrecognizable. She was always polite to Margaret, but the coldness in her eyes told a different story. Margaret had never liked the way Lily would smile so sweetly while her eyes glinted with something darker, something calculating. She had always known that Lily had married Jack for more than just love. She had married him for security, for the wealth that came with being the wife of an ambitious man. And now Lily was just as eager as Jack to get her hands on Margaret's assets. It wasn't long before Margaret realized that the visits, the calls, the promises, everything was a farce. They were only interested in her money in her house. They didn't care about her health, her happiness, or her well-being. She was just a pawn in their game, a tool to be exploited for their own gain. The realization hit Margaret like a freight train. Her own children, the people she had raised and loved, had betrayed her. They saw her not as a mother but as an obstacle, a barrier to their own ambitions. She had spent her entire life giving, but now she realized all they wanted was to take. Margaret's emotions ran the gamut: betrayal, sadness, anger. But beneath it all, something began to stir within her. She had always been a woman of quiet strength, but now, as her family closed in on her, she found a new determination. They thought she was weak, that her age and frailty made her an easy target. But they had underestimated her. She would not let them take everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed. She would show them the true power of a mother scorned. Margaret began to make plans. Slowly, meticulously, she gathered her resources. She had kept detailed records of her finances, of her properties, of her investments. She wasn't as helpless as they thought. In fact, she had more power than they realized. But Margaret wasn't just going to fight for her assets. She was going to fight for her dignity. She was going to show Jack and Lily that no one, not even family, could exploit her without facing consequences. The first step in her plan was to contact her lawyer. She needed to ensure that her will was up to date, that her affairs were in order. She would not let them take her house, her legacy, without a fight. The next step was to create a strategy, one that would turn the tables. She would make sure Jack and Lily felt the sting of betrayal just as she had. But she would do it on her own terms. No more being the victim. It was time for Margaret to take control. As she sat in the dim light of her living room, pen in hand, she made her decision. She would outsmart them. She would reclaim what was hers, and in doing so she would make them realize that they could never take her power, her love, or her dignity. She would make them regret the day they ever crossed her.
Margaret spent the following days in a haze of contemplation and quiet resolve. She had always been a woman who valued peace, who believed in nurturing her family with the love and care that only a mother could give. But now, in the face of betrayal, she realized that kindness and selflessness had not only been taken for granted, they had been exploited. The family she had spent her life building was crumbling under the weight of greed, and the thought of her children tearing apart her legacy left her feeling hollow. As the days passed, Margaret's quiet fury grew. She had been wronged, and now it was time to make things right. But first, she needed to understand the full extent of her situation. The betrayal ran deeper than she had initially thought, and the more she reflected on it, the more she realized how blind she had been. Jack, her only son, had always been a good boy, at least that's what she had told herself. She had never suspected that he would be capable of such manipulation. And Lily, well, Lily had always been charming, always eager to please, but Margaret now saw her for what she truly was. A woman who had used her charm to wrap Jack around her finger, securing her place in the family not with love but with ambition. Jack had married her not because she was the love of his life, but because she was an investment, a partnership that would secure him a comfortable future. Margaret had always suspected this, but she had never wanted to admit it. She had been content to allow Jack to live his life, believing that his happiness was all that mattered. But now she could see that it was never about love. It was about power. Margaret's thoughts drifted to the day Jack had told her about his plans to sell the house. The house. It wasn't just a property to her. It was a symbol of everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed. It was where she had raised her children, where she and Thomas had dreamed of a life of peace and love. And now it was the very thing Jack and Lily wanted to take away from her. She had spent years working to maintain the house, the property, the wealth they had accumulated. But none of it mattered to them. They didn't care about the memories that filled every corner of the house. They didn't care about the history that was embedded in its walls. All they cared about was what it could give them now. Money. Power. Margaret felt a twinge of pain in her chest. He had tried to teach Jack better. She had wanted him to understand the value of family, the importance of kindness and respect. But it seemed that all her lessons had been in vain. She had given him everything, her love, her time, her money, and yet he had thrown it all away, all for the sake of his own greed. But Margaret would not give up without a fight. She had raised Jack to be strong, to stand up for what was right. Now she would have to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The next morning, Margaret made the decision to contact her lawyer. She had known Richard for years. He was a man of integrity, a man who had helped her and Thomas with their legal matters when they first bought the house all those years ago. She trusted him completely, and now she needed his expertise more than ever. The lawyer's office was located in the heart of the city, a sleek, modern building with glass walls and a polished marble floor. As Margaret walked through the doors, she felt a sense of empowerment. She was no longer the frail, helpless woman she had been just a few weeks ago. Her resolve had hardened, and with each step she took, she felt the weight of the betrayal lift from her shoulders. Richard greeted her warmly as she entered his office. He was a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and glasses perched on the tip of his nose. His presence was calm and reassuring, and for the first time in a while, Margaret felt like she was in good hands. "Margaret, it's good to see you," Richard said, gesturing for her to sit. "How are you feeling?" "I'm better," Margaret replied, taking a seat. She sat up straight, her back stiff with determination. "But I need your help, Richard. I need to make sure that my wishes are respected. I can't let my son and daughter-in-law take everything I've worked for." Richard raised an eyebrow, sensing the weight in her voice. "What's going on, Margaret? You know you can trust me." Margaret took a deep breath. "Jack and Lily are trying to take control of everything. They want to sell the house, Richard. They want to liquidate all my assets. And they're not doing it because they need it, Richard. They're doing it because they think I'm too old to fight back. They think I'm weak." Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. "I see. And what do you want to do about it?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I want to make sure that my assets are protected. I want to make sure that, when I pass, my wishes are respected. I've spent my life building this family, Richard, and I won't let it all be torn down by greed." Margaret had always been a woman of action. She knew that Jack and Lily were smart, but they were also predictable. Their greed would be their downfall, and she would use that to her advantage. Richard listened carefully as Margaret laid out her plan. She knew that Jack and Lily would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and she needed to be just as relentless. The first step was to ensure that her will was ironclad. Richard agreed to help her with that, making sure that everything was legally sound and that no one could challenge it. But Margaret also had a more devious plan in mind, one that would make Jack and Lily pay for their betrayal.
She would ensure that the inheritance they were so eager to claim would come with strings attached. She would make sure that they had to work for it, to earn it. She would withhold it until the moment they least expected. And when the time came, she would make them understand the true cost of their betrayal. Margaret spent the next few days meeting with Richard, fine-tuning the details of her new will. She was meticulous, ensuring that everything was in place. She made sure to leave specific instructions on what would happen to the property and the family business. Everything would go to charity unless Jack and Lily met certain conditions. The conditions would be strict, forcing them to prove their worthiness. If they failed, everything would go to the causes that Margaret held dear. As she signed the new will, a sense of satisfaction washed over her. She had taken control. She had turned the tables. No longer would she be the victim in this twisted game. It was her turn to make the rules. A few weeks later, Margaret finally confronted Jack and Lily. She invited them over for a meeting, telling them that she had something important to discuss. She could sense their nervousness as they arrived, their faces trying to mask their true intentions. But Margaret wasn't fooled. She had known them both long enough to see through their facades. Sitting across from them at the dining table, Margaret looked at her son and his wife with cold, calculating eyes. They had underestimated her, and now they would pay the price. "Jack, Lily," Margaret began, her voice steady, "I've made some decisions. And you need to understand something. I won't be manipulated anymore. This house, this family, it's mine and I won't let you take it. Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Lily leaned forward, trying to maintain her composure. What are you talking about, Mom? She asked, feigning innocence. Margaret's lips curled into a small smile. You wanted control? You wanted power? Well, I've made sure that everything will go according to my terms from now on. I've changed the will. You'll have to work for what's mine. Jack's face turned red with anger and Lily's eyes narrowed with disbelief. You can't do this, Mom. We're your family. Jack snapped. Margaret stood up, her voice calm but resolute. I can, Jack. And I just did. The silence between them was thick, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a sense of power that she hadn't experienced in years. The days following Margaret's confrontation with Jack and Lily felt like a whirlwind. The calm yet powerful decision she had made in that moment had ignited something inside her, something she had not felt in years. For the first time, Margaret realized the full weight of the power she had been holding back all along. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't a burden. She was still the woman who had built a family, a legacy. And she would defend it with everything she had left. But as the days passed, the reality of her new plan began to settle in. Jack and Lily, though shocked, were not fools. They would not back down easily. And the consequences of Margaret's bold move were yet to unfold fully. She knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to retaliate. It wasn't long before Jack called Margaret. His voice on the other end was strained, full of frustration and anger. He had always been the one to try and smooth things over, to maintain some semblance of control. But this time he was furious. Mom, you can't do this. This is insane. You're forcing me to choose between my family and everything I've worked for. Jack's words came out in a rush, his anger evident. Margaret leaned back in her chair, listening carefully. The years of caring for him, of being his mother, had created a bond that was hard to sever. But now she was seeing him for who he truly was. A man driven by greed, by entitlement. He was no longer the boy who needed her care and love. Now he was the man trying to take what wasn't his. You've already made your choice, Jack, Margaret said calmly, her voice steady. You've chosen your own interests over your family, over what truly matters. You've chosen power, not love. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Margaret could hear Jack's shallow breathing, the weight of her words sinking in. Mom, this is wrong, Jack said quietly after a beat. I'm your son. You've always said you wanted what was best for me. Why are you doing this now? Why turn against me? Margaret's heart clenched, but she pushed past the pain. She knew he was manipulating her just as he always had. This was how he had gotten everything he wanted in the past. Guilt. But this time she wouldn't give in. I'm doing this because I want what's best for you too, Jack. You've lost sight of what's important. You've been blinded by greed, and I'm not going to stand by and let you destroy what's left of our family. Margaret's voice was unwavering. You can have your money, your property, your wealth. But you will not have my respect. Jack hung up the phone without saying goodbye. The silence that followed was deafening, but Margaret didn't flinch. She knew the war had just begun, but she was ready for it. In the following weeks, the tension between Margaret and her children escalated. Jack and Lily became more aggressive in their attempts to reclaim what they felt was rightfully theirs. They made subtle threats, small jabs at Margaret's independence, trying to undermine her confidence. But Margaret stood firm. She began taking action to secure her assets, moving some of her wealth into safer investments, ones that Jack and Lily couldn't easily access. She even reached out to trusted friends who had long helped her and Thomas with their finances, making sure that her estate was in order, that no one could take advantage of her in her weakened state. At the same time, she began to watch Jack and Lily more closely. She saw the subtle ways they tried to manipulate the situation, the false promises they made to friends and family, all in an attempt to gain support for their cause. They didn't understand, or maybe they refused to accept, that Margaret was no longer the helpless woman they had once controlled. It was a game of patience now. Margaret knew that if she waited long enough, the cracks in their facade would show. And when they did, she would be ready to expose them. The next major confrontation came during what should have been a simple family gathering, Thanksgiving. Margaret had always hosted, but this time she invited only her closest friends and a few distant relatives. She wanted to make it clear that she was no longer a passive participant in her own life. This was her home, her legacy, and she was reclaiming control. Jack and Lily, of course, showed up uninvited, their presence looming like a storm cloud. They tried to maintain their composure, pretending as though nothing had changed, but Margaret could see through the act. Their eyes betrayed them, greed was still in their hearts, and they weren't done fighting for what they believed was theirs. As they sat at the table, Jack tried once again to sway Margaret. His tone was soft, almost pleading, but Margaret wasn't fooled. "Mom," Jack said, his voice laced with fake concern. "You don't have to do this. You've always said that family is what matters most. Don't let money come between us." Margaret's eyes met his, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You're right, Jack. Family is what matters most. And it's time for you to learn the true meaning of family. Not just blood, not just inheritance, but love, respect, and honor." Lily, sitting next to Jack, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing nervously at Jack. She knew that their game was up. The cards were on the table and they had nothing left to hide. Margaret smiled coldly, watching the tension grow between them. "I've spent my life trying to teach you both about love. But I see now that what I should have taught you was how to live with integrity, how to stand on your own, without needing to tear others down." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Jack and Lily's faces flushed with anger, but they said nothing. The room fell silent, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt truly empowered. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's plan began to take shape. The information she had gathered on Jack and Lily's attempts to manipulate others became her weapon. She started sharing the truth with key family members, revealing how Jack and Lily had plotted behind her back. She sent letters, wrote emails, and spoke to relatives who had once been too afraid to speak up. It was slow work, but the seeds of doubt were being planted. By now, the family's reputation was starting to shift. The narrative that Jack and Lily had built, of being the loving, respectful children, was beginning to crack. People were starting to ask questions. Some even started to wonder if there was more to the story than they had been told. The power had shifted. And Margaret, though still weak, was taking control. But Jack and Lily weren't finished yet. They still believed they could intimidate Margaret into submission. Jack confronted her one final time, this time in the privacy of her home, his voice cold, his tone demanding. "You've made a huge mistake, Mom," he said, his eyes narrowing with anger. "You're pushing me too far. I'll make sure you regret this." Margaret stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides. She had lived through worse than this. She had survived when others would have crumbled. And she was not going to let her son destroy her legacy. "You've already made your choices, Jack," she said calmly. "And now you'll live with the consequences." The tension was palpable, but this time Margaret was in control. Jack's threats were empty. His power over her had been taken from him. Margaret had won.
The days after the Thanksgiving confrontation with Jack and Lily were filled with a strange kind of clarity for Margaret. Her actions had sparked the chain of events she had been waiting for. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth about her children's greed was beginning to spread. Yet, despite the growing sense of empowerment she felt, there was a nagging feeling deep within her. She was standing up for what was right, but she could not help but mourn the family that had once been whole, the family she had nurtured with so much love. Jack had not spoken to her since that night, and Lily was no better. They had retreated into their own world, and Margaret could see that the distance between them was widening. But Margaret knew one thing for certain: they were not going to let this go without a fight. They would not accept her victory, not quietly. Margaret spent her days sorting through papers, revisiting the plans she had laid out with Richard, her lawyer. She had taken measures to ensure that Jack and Lily could not gain access to her estate without meeting strict conditions. The house, the wealth, everything would go to charity unless they could prove their worth. But Margaret knew that it would take more than just legal documents to make Jack and Lily understand the full weight of what they had done. She needed to hit them where it hurt the most, where they had always been most vulnerable: their reputation. She had never been the type to publicly air her grievances, to let her personal struggles become the subject of gossip. But she was beginning to realize that the family she had loved and sacrificed for had turned its back on her, and it was time for them to face the consequences. Jack, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own demons. The initial shock of his mother's betrayal had worn off, replaced with a simmering anger. He had expected her to give in, to back down like she always had before. But Margaret's unexpected strength had left him off balance, and his frustration was growing. He had worked so hard for everything he had, but now it seemed as though his mother was trying to take it all away from him. His wife, Lily, had been vocal about her frustration. She had always been the one to push Jack toward more aggressive tactics. "We need to take action, Jack. You're not going to let her get away with this, are you? We have to make her understand that we deserve what's ours." Jack had always been the more measured one, but Lily's words were beginning to chip away at his resolve. They had always been partners in this, and now she was questioning whether he had the strength to do what was necessary. "What are you suggesting?" Jack had asked her one evening, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "You need to confront her again. Take control. She thinks she can outsmart us, but you're smarter than she is, Jack. You know how to get what you want." Lily's voice was smooth, persuasive, and Jack found himself once again being pulled into her web. But deep down, Jack knew the truth. He had always been able to manipulate situations, to convince people to see things his way. But Margaret wasn't like those people. She wasn't going to be swayed by his anger, his threats, or his empty promises. Jack was caught between two worlds, his loyalty to Lily and his guilt over betraying his mother. He was beginning to see that the cost of his ambition might be higher than he had ever anticipated. While Jack was grappling with his own internal conflict, Margaret was busy laying the groundwork for her next move. She wasn't going to wait for Jack and Lily to come to her. Instead, she was going to take the fight to them. Her first step was to ensure that her closest family and friends knew the truth. She invited her siblings, nieces, nephews, and a few trusted family members over for dinner. Margaret had always been the heart of the family, the one who brought people together, and she wasn't about to let that go unnoticed. She had always kept family matters private, but now, in the face of her betrayal, she had no choice but to speak up. The evening was set. The table was laid with food and the atmosphere was warm, just as it had been when her children were young. But the air was thick with tension, and Margaret knew that this was no longer just a casual gathering. It was a moment of reckoning. As the evening progressed, Margaret took the opportunity to talk to her guests. She carefully revealed the events that had transpired over the past few months, telling them about Jack and Lily's manipulations, their attempts to take control of the family's assets without regard for her well-being. She spoke with calm authority, but there was an unmistakable edge to her voice. "I have spent my life building this family, giving everything I could. But now I find myself questioning the people I trusted most," Margaret said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm not asking for pity and I'm not trying to destroy anyone. But I want the truth to be known." There was a moment of stunned silence as the room absorbed her words. Margaret's closest family members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. They had known Jack and Lily for years, and now they were hearing a very different side of the story. One of her nieces, Claire, spoke up, her voice hesitant but compassionate. "Aunt Margaret, I had no idea. We always thought everything was fine. I'm so sorry that this is happening to you." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "It's not just about me anymore. It's about all of us. We have to stand together. We can't let greed tear this family apart." The room fell silent again, but this time, it was a silence of understanding. Margaret had made her move, and now it was time for Jack and Lily to face the consequences of their actions. Jack had underestimated his mother. He had assumed that, like always, she would crumble under pressure. But this time Margaret was not backing down. She had made her decision and she was ready to fight. But Jack wasn't one to go down quietly. His anger had only grown since the dinner with Margaret's relatives. He had to do something, anything, to regain control. He had been manipulated by Lily, but now he was beginning to realize that his mother's strength was something he couldn't simply dismiss. One evening he showed up at Margaret's house unannounced. This time there was no pretense of civility. His eyes were filled with fury, and his voice was low and dangerous as he stepped into the living room. "You've gone too far, Mom," Jack said, his fists clenched by his sides. "You think you can control me, control this family? You're wrong. I won't let you ruin everything." Margaret stood up slowly, her posture erect. She had seen this anger before, but this time, it didn't intimidate her. "You think I'm the one ruining this family, Jack?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. "You're the one who has betrayed everything we've worked for. And now you'll face the consequences." Jack took a step forward, his expression hard. "You can't stop me. I'll take everything from you if I have to." Margaret's eyes narrowed and her heart raced. She knew what he was capable of, but she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Do your worst, Jack, she said coldly. But remember, I have more to lose than you ever will. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Jack stood frozen, unsure of how to proceed. And Margaret, for the first time in years, felt truly free.
The days that followed the confrontation were marked by a strange stillness in Margaret's home. Jack's angry visit had left an indelible mark on both of them. The once warm relationship they had shared, even with all its imperfections, was now fractured beyond repair. The tension in the house was palpable, and Margaret could feel the weight of the decision she had made. There was no turning back now. Margaret had always been a woman of patience. She had endured countless hardships throughout her life, raising her children alone after Thomas passed away, working to build a life she could be proud of. But this was different. The betrayal was different. The person she had trusted the most, her own son, had turned on her. The realization that Jack was more interested in his inheritance than his own mother stung deep in her heart. But as the days passed, Margaret knew that the time for regret was over. She wasn't going to be the victim anymore. Jack and Lily had made their choice, and now she would make hers. Jack's anger simmered for days after his confrontation with his mother. He had tried to push Margaret into a corner, hoping she would back down. But she hadn't. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how much he had lost. The house. The money. The status. His future was slipping through his fingers, and he couldn't let that happen. Lily had been no help. She had urged him to be patient, to try and find another way. But Jack wasn't the patient type. He had never been. He was used to getting what he wanted, and right now he wanted control. He wanted his mother's wealth. He wanted everything Margaret had built, and he wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way, least of all her. Jack's desperation grew as the days passed. He started reaching out to the people he knew. Lawyers, investors, people who could help him gain access to Margaret's assets. He didn't care what it took anymore. He was willing to do anything to take back what he felt was rightfully his. Margaret had always been there for him, but she had also been a roadblock in his path to success. And now she was standing in the way of the life he had always imagined for himself. But Margaret was a woman who had seen the ugliness of the world. A woman who had learned to survive even in the harshest of conditions. She wasn't going to be intimidated by Jack's threats or his desperation. While Jack plotted in the shadows, Margaret was making her own preparations. She had spent years building her wealth, not just in money but in relationships, connections, and influence. It wasn't just about owning the house or the family business. It was about something far more valuable. The power that came with knowledge. The knowledge that Margaret had gained through years of experience, years of observing the people around her. And that knowledge would be her weapon. She wasn't going to fight Jack with anger or spite. She was going to outsmart him. She was going to use the very tools he had underestimated her for. The old woman, once thought to be weak, was about to turn the tables. Margaret spent days revisiting her financial records, reviewing every investment, every piece of property, every legal document. She had always trusted Jack to handle the family business, but now she saw just how deep his greed ran. He had been siphoning money from her accounts, pushing for decisions that would benefit him and Lily. She had known that something didn't feel right, but now the truth was clear. The realization made her heart harden. Jack hadn't just betrayed her trust, he had tried to steal from her. And now she would make sure he paid the price. The first step of Margaret's plan was simple: regain control of her finances. She reached out to her lawyer, Richard, and began discussing the possibility of locking down her assets. The first thing they did was transfer the properties and investments into accounts that Jack couldn't access. Margaret had long ago put in place contingency plans for her business and her estate, but now she needed them to be put into action. Richard was impressed by Margaret's foresight. "You've been planning this for years, haven't you?" he asked as he reviewed the paperwork. Margaret smiled grimly. "I've had to. Jack and Lily aren't the first to think they can take what's mine. They won't be the last." The next step was to ensure that Jack couldn't contest the new will. Margaret's lawyer was quick to organize meetings with other family members, ensuring that everyone was on the same page. Margaret needed witnesses who could testify to her wishes, people who could confirm her intentions and the clear-mindedness with which she had made her decisions. In parallel, Margaret began to make more subtle moves. She reached out to business associates, letting them know that she was taking a more active role in the family business once again. She had been a silent partner for too long, and now it was time for her voice to be heard. Jack and Lily would soon realize that their attempts to take what was rightfully hers were futile. She wasn't just fighting for her wealth. She was fighting for her legacy, for the respect that had been taken from her, and for the future of her family.
Jack was not a man accustomed to losing control. The more he pushed, the more he found himself blocked at every turn. His calls to the bank went unanswered. His attempts to convince business partners to side with him were met with hesitation. People he had once trusted were suddenly backing away, unsure of his intentions. The once smooth path he had walked was now riddled with obstacles, and the harder he tried to push through, the more the walls closed in around him. He had always been the one in control, whether it was his marriage, his business, or his family. But Margaret's actions were shaking everything he had built. He realized too late that he had underestimated her. She wasn't just an old woman waiting to die. She was a force to be reckoned with. As Jack's frustration mounted, Lily began to see the cracks in their plans. Her once calm, calculated demeanor began to crack as well. They had expected to walk away with everything. They had thought that Margaret would fall apart when they pushed her, but instead she had stood her ground, her resolve unwavering. Lily's desperation grew. She began to whisper to Jack about more drastic measures, about pushing harder, about forcing Margaret into submission. But Jack hesitated. He didn't want to risk alienating what little family they had left, and he didn't want to push his mother so far that she would destroy them all. But it was too late for second thoughts. Margaret was no longer the woman they could control. The next major confrontation came when Jack, in a fit of rage, stormed into Margaret's home. He had run out of options. His attempts to manipulate the situation to gain control of her assets had all failed. Now it was time to confront her directly. "You think you can control everything, don't you?" Jack said, his voice low and threatening. "You've taken everything from me, Mom. The house. The business. What's left for me? For my family." Margaret met his gaze, her eyes steely with determination. "You never cared about me, Jack. You cared about what I could give you. And now I'm done. I'm done being your pawn. You can't take my legacy. You never deserved it." Jack took a step forward, his face flushed with anger. "You're making a huge mistake. You're not just fighting for your house, Mom. You're fighting your own family. And we'll make you regret it." Margaret stood firm. "I've already won, Jack. You just don't know it yet." The room was charged with tension. Jack stood there, his fists clenched, but for the first time Margaret could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He had overplayed his hand, and now it was too late to turn back.
Margaret had spent her life trying to build something for her family, a legacy she could be proud of. She had sacrificed her time, her energy, and her resources to ensure that her children had every opportunity, every gift, every advantage. But now, as she stood in the wake of her son's betrayal, she realized that the greatest sacrifice of all had been her peace of mind. The confrontation with Jack had left her shaken but not defeated. She had never thought that her own flesh and blood would turn on her. She had always believed that, in the end, family would be the one thing that remained constant in her life. But that illusion had been shattered. Jack and Lily had made it clear that their greed outweighed any love or loyalty they might have had for her. And now it was time to show them that they had underestimated her. Margaret wasn't a woman who enjoyed conflict. She had always been the peacemaker, the one who worked quietly behind the scenes, holding everything together. But now she had no choice. Her children had pushed her to the edge, and she would not let them take what was hers. They had turned her into something she had never wanted to be, an enemy. But she would be a formidable one. Margaret's strategy was simple. She needed to outmaneuver Jack and Lily. She knew they would not give up easily, and she was prepared for them to fight back with everything they had. But she had a secret weapon: knowledge. Margaret had spent years quietly observing her family, understanding their weaknesses and desires. And now she would use that to her advantage. The first part of her plan was to further solidify her legal standing. With Richard's help, she ensured that the changes she had made to her will were airtight. She wanted to make it impossible for Jack and Lily to challenge it, even if they tried. They would not get a dime unless they met her conditions that would force them to prove that they deserved it. But Margaret knew that the legal battle would be just one part of the war. The real power lay in the court of public opinion. She had to make sure that people knew what Jack and Lily had done, that the world saw them for what they truly were: greedy, manipulative, and deceitful. She reached out to friends, family members, and acquaintances, ensuring that the truth about Jack and Lily's betrayal was spread far and wide. It was subtle at first, nothing too overt, but over time the whispers grew louder. The story was spreading. As the weeks passed, Margaret felt a strange satisfaction in knowing that Jack and Lily were beginning to feel the pressure. They had always believed they could control her, that they could manipulate her into giving up what was rightfully hers. But they had failed. And now they were the ones who were being watched, being scrutinized. Margaret wasn't just taking back her home and her wealth. She was taking back her dignity, her autonomy, and her place in the world. Jack and Lily had thought they could discard her, but now they were the ones being discarded. The tables had turned. Jack, however, wasn't about to let things go so easily. He had always prided himself on being the one who controlled the situation, the one who made the rules. But now he was desperate. He could feel the walls closing in around him, and with each passing day he grew more paranoid. His assets were tied up, his plans to sell the house thwarted, and the growing public awareness of his manipulation was starting to hurt his reputation. In private, Jack lashed out at Lily. "We need to fix this," he told her, his voice low and filled with frustration. "She's making us look like the bad guys. We can't let her get away with this." Lily, ever the strategist, tried to calm him down. "We're not going to win by getting angry. We need to play this smart. We'll get the money. We'll get the house. We just need to wait for the right moment." But Jack was no longer willing to wait. His patience had run out, and the fear of losing everything had consumed him. "I don't care about the right moment. I want it now. If she won't give it to us willingly, we'll take it." Lily hesitated, sensing the danger in Jack's words. She had always known that Jack's ambition could lead him down dangerous paths, but this was different. His obsession with the inheritance was clouding his judgment. "I'm not sure that's the best idea, Jack," she said carefully, but Jack was already past the point of reasoning. "I'm done with being patient," Jack growled. "We're going to take control. It's the only way." Margaret, meanwhile, was aware that Jack and Lily were growing desperate. Their tactics had changed. They had started reaching out to her distant relatives, trying to rally support, trying to manipulate the people closest to her into siding with them. But Margaret was always a step ahead. She had seen their moves coming before they even made them. The final piece of her strategy fell into place when she received an unexpected call from an old friend, Sarah. Sarah had known Margaret for years, and the two had always shared a close bond. "Margaret, I think you need to know something," Sarah said. "Jack and Lily have been meeting with a lawyer. They're planning something big." Margaret's heart sank. She had known this moment would come, but hearing it confirmed made the reality all the more jarring. Jack and Lily weren't just planning to take her wealth. They were planning to destroy her, legally and emotionally. They wanted her to be rendered powerless, unable to defend herself. Margaret's mind raced as she considered her options. She knew they would try to make their move soon. But she was prepared. She had one last card to play, one that would leave Jack and Lily with no way out. She called Richard immediately, instructing him to prepare for the worst. She wanted all her legal protections in place, and she wanted to be ready for any attack, no matter how underhanded it might be. As she hung up the phone, she felt a sense of clarity. She had already given them everything they wanted: her love, her time, her money. But now it was time for them to face the consequences of their greed. They had underestimated her, and that was their mistake. Days later, the final confrontation came when Jack and Lily arrived uninvited at Margaret's house. They stood on the doorstep, their faces hard, their eyes full of determination. Margaret opened the door slowly, her face calm but her heart pounding. She had prepared for this moment, and she wasn't afraid. "Mom, we need to talk," Jack said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "This has gone far enough." Margaret stepped aside, letting them into the house. "What's left to say, Jack? You've made your choice. You've shown me exactly who you are." Jack's face twisted with frustration. "We're your family, Mom. We've been there for you. You can't just throw us away." Margaret met his gaze. I'm not throwing you away. You threw me away a long time ago. Now it's time for you to face the consequences. As she spoke, Richard walked into the room. He had the documents in hand. Margaret had already arranged for everything to be in order. Jack Lily, Richard said, his voice cold and firm, I'm here to make sure that Margaret's wishes are honored. The will has been updated and there's no room for negotiation. Your attempts to manipulate her to exploit her have failed. The shock on Jack and Lily's faces was immediate. They were cornered, exposed. Margaret had won. She had outsmarted them using the very system they had tried to exploit.
The weeks following the showdown were marked by a sense of uneasy stillness in Margaret's home. Jack and Lily, stunned and defeated, had retreated into themselves. For the first time in a long while, Margaret could hear the quiet hum of her house, the calm before the storm. The peace was temporary, she knew. But for now it felt like a victory. Jack, her only son, had failed to take control, and Lily, once so eager to manipulate and scheme, had fallen silent. The arrogance and entitlement that had once been so obvious in their every move had been replaced with something darker. Fear. A fear of the very woman they had underestimated, and a fear of the consequences they could no longer avoid. Jack had always believed in the idea of power, how to get it, how to keep it. And now, with his back against the wall, he was more determined than ever to reclaim what he thought was rightfully his. But the truth had become clear. He had underestimated his mother and he had pushed her too far. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't. For Jack, the prospect of losing everything, the wealth, the business, the house, was too much to bear. His desperation had grown, but so had his pride. He had come so close to victory before Margaret's unexpected move, and now he couldn't just walk away. The thought of Margaret standing over him, the symbol of everything he had failed to conquer, was unbearable. One cold morning, Jack met with his lawyer again, this time in secret. He had planned a different approach, one that would finally break Margaret. He wasn't going to try to manipulate her directly anymore. Instead, he would try to break her resolve, by dragging the battle into the courts. He would force her into a position where she had no choice but to give in, or risk losing everything in a public battle. I'm not letting her walk away with everything, Jack said, his voice low with anger. We'll drag this out. She'll have to give us something, or I'll make sure it costs her more than she can afford. His lawyer hesitated. Jack, this could backfire. You've already pushed her into a corner. If we continue this fight, we risk everything. If you lose, there may be no coming back. Jack's eyes burned with rage. She's not going to win. I won't let her. The lawyer was silent for a moment. He knew that Jack's determination was a double-edged sword. He could either win it all or lose everything in the process. But Jack had always been willing to risk it all. Now more than ever, he was determined to make Margaret pay for everything. Margaret, however, was not the woman she had once been. The woman who had been broken by her family's betrayal had long disappeared, replaced by someone who understood the true cost of the choices her children had made. She was no longer the mother who gave everything to her family. She had learned to protect herself, to protect what she had worked for, and to make the hard choices that would ensure her legacy was not stolen from her. When Richard, her lawyer, called to inform her that Jack was taking the case to court, Margaret's response was simple. Let him, she said, her voice unwavering. I will not be intimidated. Richard had warned her about the potential consequences, that the battle could drag on for years and cost her more than she anticipated. But Margaret had already made her decision. She would not be swayed by Jack's desperation, by his threats. She had already prepared for this moment and she had no intention of backing down. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, court filings, and legal battles. Margaret, while still recovering from the emotional toll of everything that had happened, poured herself into the fight. She knew that Jack would stop at nothing to win. He was determined to destroy her, to take everything she had left. But she would not let that happen. The case was drawn out. The legal documents piled up, the endless motions, the back and forth between the lawyers. But Margaret remained calm. She had expected this, and she had taken every step to ensure that her will, her legacy, and her assets were protected. Jack, no matter how hard he tried, would not be able to break her. The court hearings took a toll on both Margaret and Jack. The public nature of the case, the stories in the papers, the whispers among family and friends, began to unravel the once carefully curated image that Jack and Lily had worked so hard to maintain. People were beginning to see the cracks in their facade, to understand that this wasn't just a family squabble. This was a battle over greed, over power, and over the very foundation of what Margaret had built. At first, Jack had believed he could manipulate the public, that he could win the sympathy of their relatives and friends by playing the victim. But as the case wore on, the truth began to emerge. The more he fought, the more people saw him for what he truly was. A man consumed by ambition, willing to tear apart his family to secure his own future. Lily, too, had tried to play the role of the concerned wife, but her efforts were in vain. The lies she had woven, the manipulation, were becoming harder to conceal. Margaret's quiet but powerful strategy had worked. She had turned the family's attention back on Jack and Lily's actions, and now the world was watching. It was at the height of the court battle, after months of legal wrangling, that the breaking point came. Jack's actions had become increasingly reckless, and Margaret knew it was time to end this once and for all. She called Richard one final time. "I want to end it," she said, her voice resolute. "No more games. We're going to settle this." Richard was taken aback. "Margaret, this could mean a lot of money, a lot of power for Jack and Lily. If you settle now, they could walk away with more than you can afford." Margaret's voice softened, but there was no hesitation. "I've already lost too much. It's not about the money anymore. It's about making sure they know that I am the one who decides. I won't let them take everything I've worked for." Richard didn't argue. He knew that Margaret had made up her mind. And so they began the final stage of their plan. The final settlement came swiftly. The terms were simple. Jack and Lily would walk away with nothing unless they could prove their worth through charity work, through contributing to the family business that Margaret had built from the ground up. They would have to show that they were capable of handling what they had tried so desperately to take. It was a humiliating blow to Jack and Lily. The court ruled in favor of Margaret, and the media coverage made it clear that their greed had been exposed for all to see. In the end, they had lost more than just money. They had lost their reputations, their credibility. The weight of their actions would follow them for the rest of their lives. As Margaret stood before her family and friends, the court ruling in her favor, she felt a quiet sense of peace wash over her. She had won. But it wasn't about the money or the assets. It was about respect. It was about reclaiming the power that had always been hers. Jack and Lily, humbled and defeated, left her home one last time, and Margaret was left standing, the weight of everything she had fought for finally lifting from her shoulders.
In the days following the court's final decision, the atmosphere in Margaret's home shifted. There was no sense of triumph, no celebration. In fact, there was a quiet, almost haunting stillness that permeated her life. She had won, this was true, but at what cost? The battle with Jack and Lily had taken more from her than she had expected. Her heart ached, not from the pain of loss, but from the emptiness of seeing her family torn apart. As she walked through the house, the rooms once filled with the laughter of her children and grandchildren now seemed to echo with silence. The house itself, the legacy she had fought so hard to protect, felt different. The walls that had once held memories of joy and togetherness now seemed cold, distant, and marked by the betrayal of the very people she had trusted most. Jack and Lily had tried to salvage their pride, but there was no escape from the consequences of their actions. They were no longer the respected couple they had once been. Their attempts to manipulate the family had backfired, and now they faced public humiliation. Their friends, their business associates, everyone who had once supported them had begun to distance themselves. Lily, who had once been so confident in her ability to charm and manipulate, found herself isolated. Jack, too, struggled with the reality of losing everything. The house was no longer a symbol of success for him. It was a reminder of his failure. He had lost his mother, his family, and the respect of those around him. And for what? A house. Money. Power. He had thought he could win, that he could force Margaret to give up. But in the end it was Jack and Lily who had lost everything. Not just the material things, but the very thing they had never truly valued. Family. Margaret's life settled into a new rhythm. The legal battles were over and the estate was secure. The house, the business, the family legacy, everything was now under her control. But it didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. She had protected her legacy, but at what cost? Her relationship with Jack, once so full of promise, was destroyed. There was no going back. The bond they had shared was beyond repair, shattered by greed, manipulation, and betrayal. And Lily, the woman who had once been a part of her family, was now nothing more than a distant memory. Margaret had always believed in the power of family. She had spent her life building connections, nurturing relationships, and creating a foundation of love and trust. But now she found herself questioning everything. Was it worth it? Had she done the right thing? The answer she knew was complicated. She had fought to protect what she had built to preserve her legacy, but in the process she had lost the very thing she had fought for: the love and respect of her son. The quiet days stretched into weeks, and Margaret found herself slowly accepting the new reality. Her life had been forever changed, but there was still hope. She realized that the love she had poured into her family was not wasted. It had shaped her into the woman she was today, a woman who had fought for what was rightfully hers, who had reclaimed her dignity and her strength. And while Jack and Lily were no longer part of her life, Margaret was not alone. She had friends, family members who had always supported her, people who respected her for who she was. Not for her wealth, not for her house, but for her integrity, her strength, and her love. Margaret had spent her life nurturing others, putting them first, and now it was her turn. She would no longer let anyone dictate her worth. She would no longer let anyone take what was hers. It was time for Margaret to live for herself. One evening, as Margaret sat by the window, the fading light of the setting sun casting a warm glow on the room, she reflected on her life. She thought about Thomas, her late husband, and the years they had spent together. They had built this life together, raised a family, dreamed of a future. She had loved him deeply, and though he was gone, his presence lingered in every corner of the house. She thought about Jack, about the boy she had raised, the boy who had once looked up to her with love and admiration. And she thought about the woman she had become. She had been tested in ways she had never expected, and yet she had endured. She had survived. The path to redemption had not been easy, but it had been hers to walk, and now she stood stronger than ever before. Margaret had always believed that family was the most important thing in life. But now, as she looked back on everything that had happened, she knew that it was not just about family. It was about respect, integrity, and honor. She had fought to protect her family, to preserve her legacy, but in the end, it was her own strength that had carried her through. The decision she had made, choosing to fight back against Jack and Lily, had been the hardest of her life. But she had no regrets. She had done what was necessary to protect what mattered most. And now she could finally begin to heal. Margaret stood up from the window, her heart lightened by the realization that she had made the right choice. She wasn't done yet. There was still more to life, still more to give. She had a future to live for, a future that she would now shape on her own terms. In the weeks that followed, Margaret focused on rebuilding. She spent more time with friends, revisiting old hobbies, and taking time to enjoy the things she had put on hold for so long. She had always given to others, but now it was time to give to herself. She began writing. She had always kept a journal, but now the pages were filled with reflections, memories, and stories. She found solace in her words, a way to process everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come. One evening, as she sat by the fire writing in her journal, Margaret thought about the future. It was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while she felt hopeful. She was no longer just a woman living in the shadows of her past. She was a woman who had reclaimed her life, her strength, and her power. And as she closed her journal that night, Margaret smiled to herself. She had survived. And now she was free.
Time had passed. Weeks, then months, and with each passing day the house felt more like a home again. Margaret had found peace, though it had been hard won. She had taken her power back, not with anger or bitterness, but with quiet strength and dignity. The fight for her legacy was over, and while the wounds of betrayal still stung, they no longer controlled her. The house, once filled with tension, now carried a sense of calm. Margaret had filled it with moments of stillness, with small victories of her own making. Her life was hers again, and she was finally free from the shadow of her son's greed. Jack and Lily had gone, their place in her life severed. They had taken from her, but in the end, it was Margaret who had reclaimed what was rightfully hers. Not just the house or the money, but her peace of mind, her self-respect, and above all, her strength. As she sat by the fire one evening, Margaret allowed herself to reflect on everything that had transpired. The storm of the past year had taken a toll on her, but she had emerged stronger. The betrayal from Jack, her only son, was still something she couldn't entirely come to terms with. He had been the one person she had loved more than anything, and yet he had been the one to wound her the deepest. But now, as she looked back, Margaret realized something important. She had done all she could for him. She had given him everything: love, support, and trust. And when that wasn't enough, she had to let go. She had no regrets about that. She could no longer hold on to the hope that Jack would change. He had made his choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. The greatest lesson Margaret had learned throughout this ordeal was that love could not be forced, nor could respect be demanded. She had always believed that family was everything, but now she understood that family didn't have to mean betrayal. Sometimes family was just a title. Sometimes family was a choice. Margaret's days were now her own, and she chose how to fill them. She spent more time with her old friends, those who had been by her side long before Jack had been born. They would come over for tea, and Margaret would listen to their stories, their laughter, and their wisdom. She had missed that. She had missed having true connections, relationships built on mutual respect and love. In the mornings, Margaret would walk through her garden, the flowers she had planted years ago blooming with new life. It was a place of peace, of healing. There were no more whispers of greed or betrayal here. The garden was hers, a sanctuary where she could be alone with her thoughts. But even as Margaret embraced this new chapter, there were moments when the past would return in fleeting memories. The joy of watching Jack grow, of sending him off to college, of being there for his wedding. All the moments that should have been filled with love now felt tinged with loss. But Margaret had come to accept that she couldn't change the past. What mattered now was the future and what she would make of it. Margaret had begun to write her memoirs, documenting her life, her family, and the lessons she had learned. She didn't know if anyone would ever read them, but it didn't matter. The act of writing gave her a sense of closure, of catharsis. It allowed her to put the past to rest in a way that was personal and healing. The words flowed easily onto the pages. She wrote about her childhood, her marriage to Thomas, the joy and heartbreak of raising her children. And, of course, she wrote about Jack and Lily, the betrayal, the pain, and the final fight that had changed everything. But she didn't write with bitterness. She wrote with understanding. She understood that Jack had acted out of fear and that Lily had acted out of selfishness. She didn't forgive them, not yet, but she understood them. The more Margaret wrote, the more she felt herself release the weight of the past. She was no longer bound by the pain of their betrayal. She had made her peace with it. She had done everything she could for her family. She had loved them as best as she knew how. But sometimes love wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to let go. One day, as Margaret sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. For so long she had been consumed by the fear of losing everything: her family, her home, her dignity. But now she realized that the true power lay not in what she could hold on to, but in what she had the strength to let go. Jack and Lily's betrayal had been a painful chapter in her life, but it had also opened her eyes to something far more important: her own resilience. She had survived the worst, and in doing so she had rediscovered the strength she had buried beneath the years of sacrifice.
She had given her family everything, every penny, every moment of her time, every ounce of her love. But in the end, it was her own self-worth that mattered most. And now Margaret stood in the light of her own truth. She was no longer just a mother, a wife, or a grandmother. She was a woman who had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her power. In the months that followed, Margaret's world began to expand again. She began volunteering at local charities, helping others who had been through struggles of their own. She didn't do it for recognition or praise. She did it because it gave her a sense of purpose, a sense of fulfillment that she hadn't known in years. She found joy in giving again, but this time, it was for her own healing, not to fill the void left by those who had taken so much from her. Her writing continued, and she eventually shared her memoirs with a few close friends. They encouraged her to get them published, but Margaret had no interest in fame. She had written them for herself. They were a way to heal, to move forward, to finally let go of the past. Her children, Jack and Lily, never returned. But Margaret had made peace with that. She knew that they had made their choices, and now, it was time for her to live her life on her terms. She had always believed that family was everything, but now she knew that family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people you choose to surround yourself with, the people who respect you, who love you in return. As the years went on, Margaret continued to live a life filled with quiet dignity. She never remarried, but she found companionship in her friends, her neighbors, and the community she had helped build. Her life, though far different than she had imagined, was still full of meaning. She never forgot Jack or Lily. But she no longer let their betrayal define her. She had made peace with them and with herself. She had learned the most important lesson of all: the power to forgive, the power to heal, and the power to move forward even when the people you love have let you down. Margaret's legacy was not built on money or property. It was built on the strength she had shown in the face of betrayal, the love she had given despite the pain, and the courage it took to start anew. And as Margaret sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon once again, she smiled. She had won. She had reclaimed her life, and nothing could take that away from her. Margaret's life had been a story of endless sacrifices for her family. She gave everything: money, time, love, hoping her children would honor that sacrifice. But when betrayal struck from the ones she trusted most, Margaret's world crumbled. Her son Jack and daughter-in-law Lily saw her as a pawn to manipulate for their own gain. In the face of greed and deceit, Margaret found her true strength. Instead of yielding, Margaret took control. She reclaimed her power, her wealth, and her dignity. She exposed the lies, outsmarted her betrayers, and showed them the price of greed. She didn't just survive, she thrived. Margaret's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about rediscovering herself, rebuilding her life, and proving that no one, not even family, could take away her strength. Let Margaret's story remind us that no matter how deep the betrayal, our strength is always within us. It's time to reclaim what's ours, stand tall in the face of adversity, and never let anyone define our worth.